Well, hello everybody. My name is Roger and welcome to my channel, Roger's Reads. So today I'm continuing with my July wrap-up, bringing you part 2. So the next book that I read in July, which is the 6th one, is Scat, written by Hyttinen. So several people have recommended Hyttinen to me, so when I saw this book on Kindle as a deal of the day, I decided to pick it up. It ended up being a middle grade book rather than adult fiction, which didn't really end up mattering to me, as I do like reading some middle grade from time to time. In fact, I just read Percy Jackson the other day. So Scat ended up being hilarious, and I am really glad I read it. It also takes place in Florida, a state where I used to live and spend a good deal of time, so that attracted me as well. So Scat follows a Florida kid named Nick, whom I guess to be about 14 or so, and whose father is on reserve in Iraq, and also his friend Marta. So one day, Nick and his class are on a field trip when the swamp that they're visiting catches fire. So Mrs. Starch, a biology teacher, who happens to be the most feared and unliked of all the teachers, vanishes into the fire to retrieve an inhaler that one of the students has dropped. But the bus ends up leaving without her, as she came in her own car. So the next school day, the principal tells the students that Mrs. Starch has been called away on a family emergency. But Nick and Marta aren't buying it, especially once they discover that Mrs. Starch has no family. And they feel that there's something very, very fishy about Bunny Starch's disappearance. And yes, her name is Bunny. So they figure that the scary pencil-eating class delinquent nicknamed Smoke, who has a history of starting fires, has to have something to do with her disappearance, especially once authorities state that the fire was caused by arson. But they're not the only ones who suspect that Smoke started the fire. And but as we learn, there's a lot more to Smoke than meets the eye. But there's also a lot more that goes on in this book. There's the dodgy oil exploration company run by a shady, nefarious fellow who is scamming the state by installing illegal pipelines in the Everglades, which is a nature preserve. There's an endangered panther that's being hunted. There's a strange eco-avenging wilderness man who seems to be sabotaging the oil company's efforts. And of course, there is the mystery of what in the hell happened to Bunny Starch. This madcap book was quite a wild romp, kind of an edge of your seat, gripping thrill ride that had me interested throughout the end, and also laughing throughout the end, as it was hysterically funny in many places, with a great cast of zany characters. I thought the premise of this book also was fascinating, and Hyttinen turns this premise into an exciting, fast-paced eco-thriller that I really had a hard time putting down. So though this was a light-hearted, enjoyable romp, the book does touch on some serious issues as well, such as war, crime, environmental preservation, amputation, and neglectful parents. But it does so in a smooth way so as not to make the novel unnecessarily grim or frightening, given that this is a middle grade book after all. And as many of us like to see in our middle grade reads, the bad guys get it good at the end. So I do believe that this is part of a 4-book middle grade series that I definitely will be checking out. I also want to check out some of his adult fiction as well, because a lot of people have recommended his work to me. So I ended up giving this 4.5 stars. So the next book I ended up reading was entitled Spokes by P.D. Singer. So this was a book that I purchased on my Kindle quite a while ago, and I finally got around to reading it on my vacation. So Spokes follows Christopher Nye, a part-time writer for Cyclo World, who works in a bicycle shop and in his spare time loves to ride his bike through the hills of Colorado with his best friend Stu. Now, his pro cycling idol is Luca Biondi, who has, along with his team, recently started training in Colorado. So meeting briefly at the bike shop and later riding out on the road, Luca and Chris form a friendship that quickly grows into a relationship, but one that must be kept secret. You see, Luca cannot afford for either anyone in his team or in the cycling world to learn that he's gay, mainly concerns about negative reaction from the cycling world as well as from his sponsors. He's also very much in the closet from his parents. Now, I like the fact that Christopher knew all this going into the relationship and yet never made any demands on Luca. I also found it interesting how Chris's writing became one of the major plot points throughout the novel. This was quite an emotionally hard-hitting book, and given that cycling is a dangerous sport, there are a couple of tragedies in this book that really wrench at your heart. Now, given that this is a gay romance book, there was this aspect to it as well, which I felt was really well done. Luca and Chris were really sweet together, and the romance between them developed at a nice, slow, natural pace and in a fully plausible way. And though there were a couple of steamy scenes, they did not overpower the plot or distract from the story. There are also a lot of biking details throughout the story that I appreciated, as I used to be an avid cyclist in my younger days, and I actually used to follow the Tour de France quite closely. Now, this wasn't a story about two fellows who happened to be cyclists. Rather, Chris and Luca both lived and breathed cycling. And the story was as much about cycling as it was about the love life of these two individuals. I swear that practically every scene in this book had something to do with cycling. So that being said, I found the well-researched depth of details in regards to cycling refreshing, and people who aren't familiar with this sport will no doubt learn quite a bit about cycling from this story. So all in all, this was a compelling story from the world of professional cycling with interesting, complicated characters, vivid scenes of Colorado and Italy, all peppered with a super sweet romance. It was quite a journey that Luca and Chris took, and I'm glad I went on it with them. So I ended up giving this book 4 stars. So the next book I read this month was entitled The Ghost of Buxton Manor by Jonathan Farah. It's kind of funny, this is the second ghost story I read this month. I probably should have saved them for closer to Halloween or for Spookathon. So this book follows the ghost of 17-year-old Rupert Buxton, who for close to a century has been tethered to his childhood home. And the story here is told from Rupert's point of view. So Rupert pretty much lingers in limbo, passing his time reading and trying to remember his former life, or remember any of the details of his former life. You see, he has no idea how he died or why he's stuck at Buxton Manor. Hell, he doesn't even remember his family. So in the beginning of the novel, you really got a feeling for the ghost's crippling loneliness. But Rupert's life, or should I say his afterlife, is drastically about to change. So first, there's a visit by Dr. Wyman, a ghostly therapist who offers his services to Rupert. Then there's a strange ghostly trio of Bloody Mary, the Weeping Bride, and the Headless Horseboy, who make an appearance as well. And finally, Buxton Manor ends up getting sold, marking the arrival of a new family moving into Rupert's home. Caroline, George, and their son Aaron, who I believe is about the same age as Rupert. Now, Rupert feels an immediate and unexplainable connection to Aaron, and it seems that Aaron can also sense Rupert on some level. Now, despite Dr. Whiteman's warnings to stay far away from the mortal boy, Rupert is unable to resist. Now, of course, Rupert eventually is able to reveal himself to Aaron so that Aaron can see him, and the door to both of their worlds gets blown wide open. So, lots of angst, intrigue, and drama follows as Ruber begins to put together the pieces of his past and how they both discover Aaron's essential role in that process. Now, what I found especially interesting about this story is that the characters are loosely based on actual historical figures. Rupert Buxton and Michael Davies, who is also a character in this book, who we meet later on. And they were actually both lovers and drowned together in 1921. So Michael Davies, in real life, the real-life Michael Davies and his brothers were the inspiration for J.M. Barrie's characters Peter Pan, the Darling Brothers, and the Lost Boys. And the story of Peter Pan, in fact, plays a huge role in this book, and I found all this quite fascinating. Now, this was a beautiful book that I absolutely loved. And I have to say, in all seriousness, I really hated for it to end. I got so invested in these characters and cared so much about what happened to them. This book had ghosts, a necromancer, a mystery, intrigue, twists, turns, surprises, murder, and most of all, love. As many of you know, I read quite a few LGBT romances, but this was by far the best one that I've read in a long, long time. Though I found this a tender love story, it was a lot more, and it dealt with some very loaded issues such as grief, betrayal, regret, loss, and the paralyzing emotional suffering that follows that loss. But without giving anything away, this is also a story of hope and second chances. So, though this novel does have a romantic lean to it, that is not the main point of this story. There's so much more to it than that. So this ended up being an amazing story with endearing characters. It's funny, I read this a couple of weeks ago, and it is still on my mind. Truly unforgettable. Fortunately, I did a web search for this author, and I don't believe he's written any other books. I hope he does, because he has a lovely talent for bringing a story and a story's characters to life. So yeah, I gave this one 5 stars. So the next book I read this month was entitled Woof at the Door by Laura Morgan. A while ago, I was watching a video from Paul Reed's, and Paul mentioned this book in one of his hauls, and the premise of it intrigued me, so I went out and picked it up. So Woof at the Door is the first in a cozy mystery series revolving around Grace Wild, an animal behaviorist or trainer who has the ability to converse telepathically with animals, both domestic animals and wildlife. And she uses her skills to save animals and to help solve behavior issues for problem pets for her clients. So think Dr. Dolittle here, for those of you who are familiar with that. But Grace keeps her abilities a secret from everyone except for her sister. So her clients all just assume that Grace simply has an uncanny knack for working with animals. So the story starts out with Grace is called out to aid the police with a traumatized and angry guard dog, a Doberman named Jax. As it turns out, Jax witnessed the killing of his master, the star quarterback of the Florida Jaguars, Mark Richardson, who is also the son of the current governor. So Jax, the dog, is suffering from severe trauma, and Grace can sense in Jax his feelings of betrayal. So Grace takes the dog to her home, a home that she shares with her sidekick and best friend Moss, who is a wolf hybrid, fiercely protective and loyal to Grace. So being a veterinarian herself, Grace is able to calm down the Doberman and hopes to eventually find him a home. Now, the reason that Grace didn't pursue a career in veterinary medicine, by the way, was because of the constant chatter in her head from all of the animals. So Grace really hopes that the police will solve this murder case so she doesn't have to get involved any further in such a high-profile case. But this crime just will not go away. Grace is called back out the next day to calm a jaguar owned by a friend of hers who as it turns out, had an altercation with Richardson shortly before his murder, making him a major suspect in the killing. Now, the Jaguar, however, shows or tells Grace that her owner did not do the crime and was actually home asleep on the couch when the murder took place. So how does Grace inform the police sergeant in the charge of the case of this without disclosing her abilities? And if she has to disclose her abilities, would he believe her? So Grace then takes it upon herself to find concrete evidence to give to the homicide detective in charge, whose name is Kai Duncan, who's actually quite handsome, as it turns out. And all this leading to some quite humorous situations, especially when Grace gives vague answers to the detective's questions, ended up making her look guilty in the process. So this was really a lovely, cozy mystery and quite a fun whodunit with plenty of suspects and numerous twists and surprises that I really didn't see coming. It had a gripping, multi-layered plot with a superb supporting cast of characters. So if you're an animal lover and or a mystery buff, then you might want to check out Woof at the Door. I ended up giving this 5 stars and definitely plan on reading more books in this series. So the next book that I read in July was entitled The Sumage Solution by G.L. Carriger, who is the pen name of Gail Carriger, who's written many other books. Now, I run this book in a Goodreads drawing. So first of all, a big thank you to Ms. Carriger for providing a copy of this book. Of course, the reason I entered into this drawing in the first place was because the blurb intrigued me, and I'm really glad that I got a chance to read this book. So this is an urban fantasy LGBT romance that follows 2 characters, Max and Brian, also known as Biff, and the story takes place in the San Francisco Bay Area. So Max is a gay and hysterically snarky, foul-mouthed, somewhat grumpy Sumage, which is a mage who can't actually do any real magic themselves. Sumages usually end up cleaning the magical messes of others. So Max is stuck in a crappy government job as a bureaucrat, doing basically drudge work, pushing papers. So the place where he works is the DURPS, which is the supernatural equivalent of the DMV. You know, I wrote down the acronym, but I didn't write down what it stands for. And I really can't remember what it stands for, but basically, any supernatural being who comes into town has to register at and be approved by the DURPS. So one of Max's paper-pushing duties there is to process these incoming supernaturals and decide whether they get approved or not. So enter Brian, called Biff by his pack, who is an extremely well-muscled and gruff beta werewolf with a heart of gold. But he's also in the closet and is not even out to his pack. So it's worth mentioning that typically werewolves cannot stand being around mages because mages smell absolutely horrible to them. They have a kind of chemical stench to them. But what's interesting is that Max actually smells good to Brian/Biff. Brian also finds the mage to be exceptionally good looking, and there's a good chance that the hunky werewolf might be willing to leave his closet if he can only get the mage to go out on a date with him. Now, Brian is really a sweetheart of a character, and you can't help but love him as the story progresses, especially once we figure out that he has somewhat of a white knight complex. He's extremely protective of everybody in his life and willing to swoop in to rescue someone at a moment's notice. So in this way, he basically fits a caretaker archetype. Now, Max, on the other hand, takes snark to a whole new level, but he is really laugh-out-loud funny. He becomes all the more endearing when we learn that a lot of his grumpy and snarky exterior is basically a facade to hide the fact that he's been very hurt in the past and as such has deep relationship issues. Oh, and he has deep daddy issues as well. So, needless to say, Max and Brian end up getting together, but it's not smooth sailing for them. Max has many, many hang-ups that he needs to get past. And then there's the whole reaction of Brian's pack, who didn't even know that Brian was gay, much less dating a mage. And there's also a mystery to be solved surrounding Max's dead father, Max's childhood homestead, which is protected by strong magic, and a powerful and dangerous codex, an ancient manuscript in book form that resides in Max's father's house. Which is probably why there's an endless stream of mages trying to get past the house's magical barriers. I really love the world that the author has created here, giving us a modern-day San Francisco, except populated by all manner of shifters, magicians, and the enigmatic kitsune, I think that's how you pronounce it, which are foxes who appear in Japanese folklore. Now, this being a gay romance, there is sex in the book. A lot of it, actually. But the majority of the sex scenes were pretty much relevant to the plot, and we learned a lot more about the characters from these scenes. But it is quite steamy in places, so if you prefer your novels squeaky clean, then you might want to pass on this one. But overall, I found the Sumage Solution to be a fun mad camp romp that was charming, intriguing, with lovable characters. I do believe this is going to be a series, so I definitely will be reading the next one in the series when it comes out. And I ended up giving this quirky original book 4 stars. So I think I'm going to stop there for part 2 of my July wrap-up, and I will conclude this in the next part. So as always, I thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate all of your support, and I will talk to you in the next video. Bye-bye.